All right, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Thank you to Alejandro Huerta from Enterprise Community Partners and Chad Horsford from California Housing Partnership for our webinar today on AHSC. And I'm going to give it to them to start us off.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. We are going to deliver an AHSC 101 presentation to you all today. My colleague will just talk in a minute, and I will deliver it together. So I will focus on some of the public partner side of the application, and then he'll focus on some of the financial bits. So the goal of today is to give you all an overview of the AHSC Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program, and also give you some best practices on what to look for in terms of determining how competitive your AHSC application could be. And then we'll end with a brief timeline of the next round and some additional sources for you to seek technical assistance from us. So I will start. Again, I'm Alejandro Huerta with Enterprise Community Partners. If you don't know us, we're an affordable housing nonprofit I'm based in Los Angeles. However, we have two markets in California, one in Northern California, one here in Southern California. In terms of the technical assistance we provide on the AHSC program, any given year we work on approximately 2/3 of the successful applications throughout the state. And we are also technical assistance providers on behalf of the Strategic Growth Council, which is one of the bodies that oversees the creation and implementation of the AHSC program. As I said, am based in Los Angeles, but I have workers in the Central Valley as well as the Bay Area. So between all of us, we cover the entire state. And I specifically focus my TA work on both the county and city of LA, but also in my capacity as technical assistance provider for the state, I oversee all of the Southern California region. And lastly, I also provide technical assistance on one of the sister programs of AHSC, which is the TCC program. So that's a little bit about Enterprise Community Partners. That I will pass it on to my colleague to describe himself and the organization.
Hi, I'm Chad Horsford. I am an associate director at the California Housing Partnership. Glad to see many of you here today. The California Housing Partnership is a nonprofit. We provide technical assistance to nonprofit affordable housing developers, as well as public agencies. We've been around since 1988, and in that time have helped to preserve and create more than 85,000 affordable homes, have helped train over 35,000 affordable housing and public agency staff members, and have helped to leverage over $30 billion in public and private financing. Next slide. And a lot of our work centers on financial consulting, working with nonprofit affordable housing developers and public agencies, including doing housing finance training such as this. We also have a really robust policy and sustainability team, as well as a research team who helps to create great publications, as well as housing data tools, which you can find on our website. But looking forward to doing this training with Enterprise. We've worked with Enterprise for a number of years on AHSC TA work.
Great, thanks, Chad. So I'm going to start our AHSC 101 now. So I'll start with a very big program overview. Again, the goal of this is to give you a sort of sweeping overview of the program, and then also go into some of the details of what the program funds, as well as how to determine if you will be competitive for the HSC application. So broadly speaking, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program is a joint loan and grant program that gets its monies from cap and trade dollars through the auction proceeds. These auction proceeds feed into the CCI, or California Climate Investment Programs. Some of you all know, just refer to this as cap and trade. And one of the Communities program out of these funds, it is a dedicated funding stream, which I'll go into. And basically, it funds two components: affordable housing and transportation together. those both create an AHSC application. And I want to underscore that this program does incentivize GHG emission reductions, and that will be a running theme throughout today. That is that in order to determine whether you are competitive or not, the number one thing to think of is that this program does look to incentivize projects that will reduce greenhouse gases. Secondly, and I want to underscore this as well, is that this program requires collaboration between both U.S. housing developers as well as public partners, because another critical piece besides your housing is the transportation components. So that's an overview of the AHSC program. I'm going to go a little bit into some of the funding here, and it seems like there are some audio problems. So let me, Chad, would you be willing to present this slide?
Sure. So to talk a bit about AHSC funding, AHSC funds are provided through cap and trade proceeds. And over the years, we've seen the funding for AHSC programs increase year by year. To date, over 3.1 billion has been awarded, and that goes to a combination of housing, transit, and active transportation projects within the AHSC program. For AHSC round 8, which is the round that is going to be out soon, we're estimating approximately $650 million available in funding. And again, just to reiterate, that's for a combination of the affordable housing development as well as transportation components. As in the last round, the maximum per application is going to be 50 million per application. And it's important to know that AHSC runs in an annual cycle. So toward the end of the year, we all start gearing up for the next AHSC NOFA to be released. And that AHSC runs through 2030. In the next few slides, we'll be diving into a bit more about how the AHSC funds are allocated between the affordable housing portion as well as the transportation portions. Is there anything else you'd want to add there, Alejandro?
No, thanks. Hopefully this audio sounds better for you all, but no, thanks. That's great, Chad.
Yeah, sounds a lot better on my end. Great. So to dive into AHSC a bit more, AHSC's a little unique amongst the HCD programs in that you're not just dealing with an affordable housing program, but you also have the transportation elements as well. So to kick things off, if we focus on the first bucket that we see, which are the funds available for affordable housing development, that's the affordable housing development loan. We'll call that the AHD loan. And then you also have funds tied to housing related infrastructure or HRI. The affordable housing development loan, that's similar to most HCD programs that you work with, where those are funds that help to support the development of affordable housing. HRI, if any of you have worked on the IRG program, it's a bit similar in that the HRI grant funds are available to fund infrastructure costs required by a locality as a condition of approval. So if we think about development costs, that'll be things like your sewer or utility systems upgrades, anything infrastructure costs broadly required as a condition of approval. One change that we've noticed within the round 8 guidelines is that HCD and SGC have added in or proposed that deposits and payments tied to factory built housing are eligible as an HRI use. That's a really important thing that we'll dive into a bit more about some potential applications if that sticks around. But typically the developer manages the scope of the AHD loan as well as HRI scope. Next up, we have some funding categories tied to transportation and active transportation costs. So first we have sustainable transportation infrastructure, or STI. We'll minimize the mouthful of words. And then we also have transportation related amenities, which we can also call TRA. So STI covers capital improvements, things sidewalks, bike lanes, transit capital items, like EV buses that facilitate mode shifts. all of those items allow people to make a shift from utilizing a car for getting around to using public transportation. These costs typically fall within the public right of way, and therefore they're typically in the purview of a public agency. It may not always be the case, but particularly for developers who are working in LA, for example, the city of LA and Metro are going to be at the table, and this is typically within Metro's scope and what they'll take control over. TRA, on the other hand, these are items that enhance the use of STI items, so help to make using public transportation more comfortable. Think about street trees. I know in the middle of summer, it can be a very uncomfortable environment waiting for the bus. So street trees, bus shelters, bicycle parking, things that are added on top of the STI infrastructure and just help to make that experience a bit more comfortable for people. Again, these are items within the public right of way and typically handled by a public agency partner. And then the last item we have are the program elements. And within the AHSC program, you'll see that AHSC will fund operating expenses for up to 3 years of programming, up to $600,000. There are various program elements that are tied to scoring within the program. So as you dive into the AHSC application and see what you need to get points on, it'll also push you to think a bit more about programming elements that you can help to support. So for example, there are points tied to anti-displacement work, as well as workforce development. And those items can be supported through the program funds that you apply for here. And additionally, AHSC requires that a developer funds one transit pass per restricted unit for at least a 3-year period. I know for a while, for a lot of developers I worked with, it's like, well, how do we fund this? Well, through the program bucket, you're eligible to fund that cost through the program funds. Great. And then thinking about how the funds come into the project, you have the AHD loan, which for many of you who've worked with AHD funding, the terms will look very similar. It'll be a deferred payment and residual receipts loan that'll come in at 3% simple interest for 55 years. Similar to programs like MHP, for example, you do have a mandatory fee of 0.42% that's paid annually. And then the AHD loan is available only during the permanent phase of development. So it's not available as a construction source, and that's important to keep in mind. The STI, TRA, HRI, and PGM grants, those are grant funding on the other hand. So there's no interest rate attached to them. There's also, there's not the mandatory 0.42% fee. And then those funds can all be available during construction and roll into the permanent phase for the affordable housing work. This is important to hold on to, particularly around the HRI funds, if the proposed regs stand and factory built housing is an eligible use, because if you are doing modular or factory built housing, that can allow you to tap into HCD funds a bit earlier and help to diminish your interest reserve carry due to not having to carry as large of a construction loan. Next slide. So thinking about eligible costs within the AHSC program, the AHD loan is going to look very similar to what you see in other HCD programs. So supporting new construction, rental housing, whether that's multifamily, senior. The AHSC program can be used for homeownership projects. If you're working on an adaptive reuse, we'll touch on some case studies at the end of this presentation. That is an eligible use, as well as acquisition and substantial rehab. Again, the HRI funds, think about infrastructure and conditions of approval. Those are the two things you're gonna want to hold on to as you think about eligible uses that you can fund through the HRI portion as opposed to the AHD portion. And lastly, the program funds. you'll have transit passes as an eligible use, as well as the program elements, whether that's anti-displacement or workforce development programming that you'll likely want to support in order to garner points in those categories.
Thanks, Chad. I will go over now the other crucial part of the funding bucket, which is all the public improvements and those eligible costs. So broadly speaking, as Chad mentioned, there are these two categories, STI and TRA. For the STI, that really is focused on funding big things that will get people out of their cars, as Chad mentioned. So what that means is the AHSC grant will pay for new or upgraded bikeways, pedestrian improvements as well, including any associated crosswalks, signal enhancements, etc. So those are the bike and ped improvements primarily. And these usually are paired with traffic calming measures in order to make complete streets. So that's sort of one bucket, is anything that's in the public right of way, bikeways and walkways. The second is anything related to transit. So here is where the transit partners come in, as Chad said, where they are looking to partner with you on procuring vehicles, so whether that's buses or train cars, as well as the actual infrastructure. So think about creation of bus-only lanes, for example, and anything associated with that. As this diagram shows, it shows some of those elements of a BRT. And then lastly, although rarely used, AHSC also funds the actual transit operations for transit partners. So this, again, is the STI category in terms of eligible funds. The next one, the sister, is the TRA program, and that basically is designed to, as Chad mentioned, fund the amenities for the bicyclists and pedestrians. This is important for a lot of local jurisdictions because it includes things like bus shelters, street lighting, urban greenings, in other words, planting street trees, as well as any improvements to the actual transit stops. So here in LA, for example, we see bus shelter improvements, etc. So these are the two major public partner categories of funds, STI and TRA. Next, we'll go into describing what the major requirements are in terms of how you associate your project with a project area, as well as the actual thresholds. And actually that will answer one of the questions that's in the chat, which is, do the STIs have to be directly in front of the project? So I will answer that in the next couple of slides here. So in the first test for you to determine if you are eligible for AHSC is to see if there is a qualifying transit stop within a half-mile walking distance of your proposed housing site. And that determines these categories that you can apply to an AHSC, which is the TOD category, the ICP category, and the rural category. The only difference between the first two, which is what most jurisdictions in Southern California fall under, is the frequency of the transit vehicle that passes, as well as the permanence of any infrastructure. So the way I like to think about it is most projects that are near heavy rail or light rail stations, remember it has to be within a half-mile walking distance, fall under the TOD category. And all other projects that are within a half-mile walking distance of any bus stop fall under the ICP category. So that's the first test, is you have to make sure that you are within a half-mile walking distance of any of these types of transit. That's how you get into the AHSC pool. The second thing is that you meet the minimum density requirements. This generally is not an issue, but I'm going to mention them anyway, just to give you a sense. So for the TOD projects, remember those are the projects within a half-mile walking distance of major heavy rail and light rail stations. The minimum density is 30 dwelling units per acre. And then for all others, it's 20. And of course, you ratchet that down for rural projects. Again, this is a minimum just to get into the AHSC competitive pool, but by no means is it something to strive for. And I'll explain that at the very end. Most projects exceed these densities. So some key readiness and threshold considerations here, and in addition to the minimum densities I mentioned, you will have to demonstrate by the time of application that you have site control for your housing development. You will also have to demonstrate that you have the experience to develop a similar project of similar scale and size. This can be a little bit tricky for newer developers. You will have to certify this by providing 2 certificates of occupancy of similar projects from the last 10 years. So think about that to make sure you have satisfied that. The fourth one here is really critical as well and determines a lot of whether or not you can apply to AHSC in any given year. And that is that you must have your land use approvals. And I'll note that these are discretionary approvals, so design review does not count here. You must have those in hand by the application deadline, as well as any associated environmental clearances. Obviously, if you're going through CEQA streamlining or CEQA exemption, then that's fine. And then these next 2 are newer requirements. Well, one of them is newer, the other one is not. So you are also required to have a all-electric construction and no gas hookups, in other words. And then, as we've mentioned before, you must provide a minimum of 3 years of transit passes. So those really are critical to determine whether or not you are ready to apply in any given round. In terms of looking at things on the back end, if you are awarded an AHSC award, you have 5 years to complete your housing development. And the public improvements are also expected to be completed within that time frame. On the flip side, you can't have started construction either for this. So the reason I'm mentioning these thresholds is because sometimes you need to think about the timing in terms of partnering with cities that may require authorizing resolutions. And in addition, because as Chad mentioned, we usually require partnering with transit agencies and other transit partners, you will probably need to have some sort of side legal agreements in order to codify the responsibilities of each party. So these are some of the key threshold and performance requirements for the AHSC program. I'm going to turn it over back to Chad to go now into more detail on the financial aspects of the program.
Thanks, Alejandro. I just want to touch a bit on financial considerations where, for example, as a developer is thinking about a project and, well, can we apply for AHSC? Are we going to be able, is this project going to be competitive? What I think through with them. So the first is to hold on to that AHSC does have points tied to having permanent financing funds committed. So one thing to keep in mind as you're looking at your project and how it's structured, those points are tied to having all your perm financing pieces, including project-based rental assistance and operating subsidies committed. One thing that's unique about the AHSC program is AHSC from its inception has been structured where you're not necessarily going to score full points. So therefore, in looking at your project and whether it's going to be competitive or not, there are going to be various trade-offs to keep in mind. So depending on what you're estimating for your greenhouse gas reductions and how you do there may be elements where you may not pick up points, but you're okay applying because you know you do well in another bucket. A threshold requirement across HCD programs is going to be that the combination of all your HCD loans and grants on the affordable housing portion has to be less than or equal to 40% of total development costs if you're proposing a 9% project, and less than or equal to 50% of TDC if you're proposing a 4% project. That's a threshold requirement. There's no way, broadly speaking, no way around that. So just something important to hold on to as you're figuring out how much you want to request from AHSC compared to how much your project costs. AHSC has points tied to housing affordability, and those housing affordability points are broken into 2 sections. The first looks at the percentage of ELI units, and in order to garner points, you have to be somewhere between 15% up to over 25%. I highlight this because if you have a project that you have not been looking at for ASIC purposes, for TCAC and SIDLAC purposes, you only need a minimum of 10% at 30% AMI. And therefore, in order to gain housing affordability points, you may have to think a bit about whether to increase the percent of ELI units in your development. And that'll be something that as a developer, you'll want to sit with for a bit. Additionally, there are housing affordability points tied to the percentage of 3-bedroom ELI and VLI units. So 3-bedroom units at or below 50% area median income, and you gain points depending on if you have a minimum of 10% of 3-bedroom units below 50% area median income, and you can get more points if you go up to having 20% plus 3-bedroom units below 50% AMI. Additionally, there's the 3-year transient pass requirement. As I highlighted earlier, that can be supported by the program budget, but that's something that typically I don't see in non-ASIC budgets, and therefore is something important to hold on to as you're thinking about your project budget long term. And lastly, ASIC has an urban greening component where there's a minimum of $200,000 that you have to spend for urban greening. This is important to highlight because the urban greening component has to be publicly accessible in most cases. And most of the tax credit projects I work on don't have publicly accessible components. So as a developer, know that you have to meet this $200,000 requirement and think about where you're going to locate that use and what it's going to be. There's also a carve out here where you can do, for example, on-site community gardens that are accessible only to residents in order to meet a portion of this. But just know that the $200,000 requirement is there, and it's probably something that's not already in your budget if you have not applied for ASIC before, and therefore it is something you'll want to think about how you're going to tackle. Next slide. Okay, so walking through what a proposed sample budget may look for ASIC, because the ASIC program is made up of various buckets, and you're applying for different program elements. Your total ASIC requests in this example that we're seeing right now is going to be 45.8 million, but that 45.8 million is going to be made up of first the AHD or HRI loan. Those have to be at least 50% of the total, up to a maximum of 35 million. Then on top of the AHD and HRI X, you'll have the STI component. That has to be at least $7.5 million or 25% of the total ASIC funds requested. So in this case, at least 25% of the 45.8 million. Then you have the TRA component, which has to be at least 1.5 million or 5% of the total ASIC requests. And lastly, you'll have your program component, which can be up to $600,000. So this total budget meets all the check marks for what we can put in and comply with ASIC requirements. $45.8 million total. That's under the $50 million per project cap. And then individually, all the individual components meet their requirements as well. So considerations for sizing your ASIC requests. Remember, the maximum is $50 million total, and that $50 million maximum is not the maximum for just the affordable housing development loan, but it's the maximum for the AHD component as well as the STI, TRAs, and program components. In terms of sizing your ASIC loan, the affordable housing development loan follows the MHP loan limits. So on a per unit basis, you'll want to take a look at the MHP per unit loan limits. And in order to successfully size your ASIC request, you're going to max out at $35 million. we know that housing costs have gone up across the board, so just be mindful that the max that you can request for the AHSC loan plus HRI grant is 35 million. For the transportation allocations, it'll be the lesser of 25% or $7.5 million of your total ASIC requests. In many cases, we see this above $7.5 million. And then 5% or 1.5% for the TRA portion. Again, as far as threshold, you just have to meet the lower of those two, but depending on what you're proposing for your STI scope or TRA scope, they can be above that limit. Lastly, one important consideration that often gets overlooked with ASIC, I believe, is GHG efficiency, where by and large, I think there's a bit of a misnomer where people believe that you have to be a really large project to perform well in the ASIC competition. And while it is true that there are points tied to your greenhouse gas reduction, and that is tied to the project size, there is also a component of the greenhouse gas scoring that looks at GHG efficiency. So it looks at the greenhouse gas reduction in relation to your total ASIC request. So if you are a smaller project, you'll likely be providing less greenhouse gas reductions, but depending on how much money you ask, you can do really well in this greenhouse gas efficiency section. And I've seen smaller projects compete well by holding on to the fact that they may not do well in that first component of the greenhouse gas scoring, but being really intentional about the amount of ASIC funding they requested in order to do well in the second half of the scoring component.
Great, thanks, Chad. So I'll go over some of the scoring and GHG considerations. I'll note that there was a question about if you cannot do the urban greening on site. Yes, you can partner with a public agency and they can help create the urban greening scope. And I forgot to say that the project area for ASIC is a 1 mile project area from your housing site. So you don't have to have the improvements right in front of your development or even adjacent to it. As long as it's within a mile, that should be fine. There's caveats, of course, but generally you have a 1 mile project area. And I also wanted to mention these STI and TRA 25 or 7.5 and 5 or 1.5 million. These are targets to make sure that you are the most competitive. If you're not able to achieve those, you will lose out on some points. Just wanted to clarify that. In terms of GHG quantification, the reason I mentioned at the very beginning this is so important is that it's because it is 30% of your total score out of 100. So in other words, it's a substantial chunk and the largest chunk of all the points. And so that's why we really like to emphasize that the GHGs are the most important. And I'll note here that there's 3 categories in which you're scored for your GHGs. The first one, GHG transit and shared mobility, are for all those things that you're going to do in terms of partnering with a transit agency or a public works or transportation department from a city or county to create those bikeways, to create those walkways, and to procure whatever transit vehicle or creation of a transit project to get your transit GHGs high. The second category, GHG project area, is basically anything related to your housing development and some of those public improvements. So I think it's really important to remember that your housing development in and of itself is really critical in terms of the unit count. And I'll share some of the data of who was awarded last round. And then as Chad mentioned, this GHG efficiency score is really, really important because 15 out of these 30 points come from that efficiency. I just want to correct something I just said. The bikeway and ped improvements are actually reflected in the GHG project area scores right there in the middle. And I wanted to make sure everyone understood that even though it may seem from this slide that the GHG transit, because it only says 5 points, plays a minimal role in the overall score, That's not accurate because those transit GHG reductions are also taken into account in the GHG efficiency score. So in actuality, 20 out of the 30 points are heavily influenced by your GHG transit. So I want to emphasize that. The remainder of the AHSC application consists of two other major components. One is the quantitative policy scoring, shown here, and narrative scoring. On this slide, rather than go into the details, I do want to emphasize that the most really critical part of these points to get a successful application is all the active transportation improvements. As you can see at the very top, it's worth 14 points. So what I like to tell applicants is that you must focus on finding that competitive GHG transit component, and you must also focus on maximizing your bicycle and pedestrian points in collaboration with your local jurisdiction. Lastly, there is a narrative, which is 18 out of the 100 points. The way I like to think about this is that AHSC is not a creative writing contest. It's really looking to see how your narrative reflects the extent of community engagement you did and how your actual development and application as a whole consider these issues here like climate resiliency, equity and transformation, and air pollution. So this is the 100 points. You're not expected to get 100 points. Generally, we're looking for projects that score above 75 or 80 points to be competitive and win. Again, that depends on any given round. The next phase of this presentation is to address some of the misconceptions and myths around the greenhouse gas reductions. And actually, I will answer live one of the questions right now in the Q&A, which is basically about GHG reductions. Someone asked, are senior projects still scored less favorably? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. And the logic behind that is that seniors will tend to drive less to begin with, and therefore the potential for them to reduce greenhouse gases is less so than someone who is not a senior. So that is something that is important to remember, that senior projects do unfortunately tend to score lower on the GHGs, but that does not mean that you cannot apply as a senior project, because as Chad mentioned, there's a lot of variables, and if you're able to find a competitive transit piece, and that can make up that difference. So let me first go into the first myth I hear often, and that is that if you're applying to AHSC, you need to hire a GHG modeler. This is unfortunately not true. Maybe initially in the first couple of rounds or 3 rounds, it was a complicated process to calculate the GHGs. Ever since then, the Air Resources Board, or CARB, has made the GHG calculator publicly available and has streamlined the process so that all you really need is your housing inputs and the transit inputs, and the calculator itself will spit out your GHG reductions. So it's not rocket science, and all it requires is playing around with it. So that's the first myth that oftentimes I hear that I wanted to dispel. Another thing that I hear often is, well, my project will have a lot of bike and sidewalk improvements in the project area, and therefore that will result in high GHG reductions. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that the bicycle and pedestrian improvements have minimal impact on the GHG reductions. But if you remember from that scoring table I showed earlier, they're very important, and that other set of 14 points for active transportation. So you can't really discount the importance of these bike and ped improvements, but it is important to remember that on the GHGs, they actually have a fairly minimal impact. Another myth I often hear as a TA provider is, oh, my project will score high on the GHG reductions because the housing development is near all this existing high ridership transit like bus lines, etc. The fact of the matter is only new ridership counts for the GHG reduction. So this is really important. oftentimes people think that just because they're located next to ridership that has a lot of frequency or that has recently been improved, that they'll get those GHG reductions. Unfortunately, AHSC is looking for new net ridership. So that's really, really critical to understand. Another thing that I've heard proposed is shuttles, microtransit as potentially giving ridership on the logic that it's connecting your housing development to local amenities. The fact is, unfortunately, that shuttles and other things like microtransit, like the micros that are out there, tend to have low ridership. And that's because those types of vehicles tend to have a much shorter route to begin with, and the smaller vehicles tend to carry fewer transit riders. So you're actually not having a major impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I often get the question about bike share. So even though it is an eligible cost, and the logic is that you can get out of your car by biking, the GHGs, unfortunately, for bike share relative to other transit modes are unfortunately a lot smaller. This next one is something that has come up a lot in the recent years with the transition from diesel buses to electric buses. A lot of potential applicants think that replacing those diesel buses with electric buses will be a good GHG project. That's a myth. The fact is that the replacement of the buses in and of itself will not increase the ridership, even though, yes, an electric bus spews less GHGs than a diesel bus. Going back to that rule before, if it's not creating new net ridership, then it's not going to increase your GHG reductions. Oftentimes, I also hear my project is located near a transit station with a lot of rich amenities that will therefore get people to ride that transit. And unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that amenities have not been shown, at least a transit agency that I work with has not been able to devise a method to calculate how the amenities actually increase ridership. So I would say that counting on amenities for reducing GHGs is not a good strategy. One other possible option of funding, as I mentioned earlier, is to fund the transit operations. And obviously, this is a big demand from transit agencies. Sometimes people think that those fundings of the operations will therefore help the GHG reductions. Unfortunately, the projects that we have seen with ridership associated with the operations only tends to be lower than procurement of the vehicles tied to larger frequencies. And then the other thing that we've been mentioning a lot for some reason, it's kind of funny, is the transit passes. So people think, okay, well, if I buy transit passes, people will use the buses more. The fact of the matter is, as Chad has mentioned several times, that this is a requirement for everybody. So everyone has to buy transit passes. And moreover, the fact of the matter is that the GHG reductions from the transit passes tend to be minimal. And only if you extend it perhaps by many, many years can you get some GHG gain. So with all of that, sort of dispelling some of the myths and misconceptions of the GHGs, question is, how do you get high GHG reductions? And I want to focus on a couple of things, both your housing project itself, as well as that crucial transit piece. So generally on the transit, there's 3 ways to increase your GHG reduction score. And that is partnering with the transit agency that is going to increase service in some way of their transit fleet. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that transit agency or locality has a method to improve the reliability and safety of that transit mode in such a way that it will increase ridership. And the third way is a little bit nebulous, in which is that the transit agency creates some project that somehow decreases travel times, with the result being that people will ride more often. So those are the 3 ways that we look toward in terms of reducing the GHG reductions through transit ridership. And it all boils down to being in the right place at the right time. This is really important. So first, you have to think of your project within that 1 mile radius. You have to see if there's transit within that mile that is going to have some sort of increase in frequency, et cetera, as I mentioned above. And this is the hard part, that you are applying to ASIC on a given round that will fall within the 5-year time frame where that transit agency has to have a project that they're going to fund that will increase that ridership. So for example, maybe a couple of years ago, if you applied and you were thinking, well, there's going to be all these projects that are going to come online for the Olympics. Well, 5 years from a couple years ago would be beyond that horizon would be sort of too soon. In other words, 2028 would be too far off, so that wouldn't work. So really think about your 5-year time frame and then the location and the ability of the transit provider to have a project in that time frame. And then I'm going to finish this out and we'll pass it on back to Chad for a case study, and then we'll round it out with 10 minutes of Q&A. So who won last round? This is taken from the data from the round 7 application awards. In terms of your housing, this is why I emphasize the importance of your unit count, but by no means does this mean that if you don't have these unit counts that you're not able to win. In fact, the case studies that will show projects with fewer units than these. But I wanted to give you a general sense. Last round, for all those projects near buses or ICPs, the average unit count was 121. And for TODs, the projects next to the heavy rail and light rail stations, 131. So you could see it is a large unit count that tends to win. In terms of the transit pieces, all of the awarded Los Angeles projects had each 7 to 9 metro buses that they procured, with tied to frequency improvements that resulted in them having large GHG transit scores. Second project in Southern California, that one set of projects was a project in Riverside, and there they partnered with with a transit provider to procure 42 van pool vans, which take workers from point A to point B, and that 42 vans had a large transit GHG reduction. Other projects in terms of transit that won in California were projects that had new rail stations, rail cars, and bus-only lanes. So that's the type of magnitude of projects that we're looking for in terms of winning. Next, I'll pass it over to Chad to go over a case study briefly.
Sure. I'll touch briefly on this. This is HHH New Hampshire, which is a proposed 93 unit affordable housing development in Koreatown that Bridge Housing is working on. This was a TOD project. It's within walking distance of the Wilshire, Vermont station. Like Alejandro highlighted on the prior slide, the average for TOD awardees was around 131 units, I believe. This was a 93 unit development, so less than the average. Smaller units because these were all studio or 1-bedroom units. But if you look at the total ASIC amount requested, particularly that housing component, that I'm going to round up to 18.9 million, is less than the project is eligible to request on a per unit basis. But in order to do well on the GHG efficiency side, the developer made the decision to request a bit less, and it paid off with an award. So when you think about your projects and what works well and how to compete, just because you're a bit smaller than where you've seen the averages work out, ASIC gives you a lot of tools in order to piece together a competitive application, and it's good to hold all those elements in tandem. Similar to the other LA awardees, this included the procurement of 7 EV buses, and also the creation of new bike networks and improvements to it. Alongside it, there's a bike lane that runs straight into downtown. So you have impactful development going on, not just in that transit component in terms of buses, but also in terms of bikeways. From a programming element, there was funding included to expand bike safety, maintenance, and repairs, particularly focusing on low-income residents in the surrounding community. So all in all together, you see a $31 million AHSC request, of which 60% went toward the housing component in the form of an AHD loan. And then you had the bulk of the remaining requests, I believe is 37% that went towards transportation improvements between the STI and TRA components. And then a bit over $600,000 that went toward the programming element. And the reason that amount is above $600,000 is because the transit passes were excluded from the $600,000 cap.
Thanks, Chad. I'm just going to briefly go over another example, just because some people think that only projects in major cities like LA can win. This is a project that was awarded in round 6 in downtown Oxnard, 87 units, primarily focused on providing housing there in that area. This project was successful, similar to the one that I mentioned earlier in Riverside, because it partnered with the van pool authority to procure a significant amount of van pools, 42. This was their AHSC request. So wanted just to give you an example of this other jurisdiction that was also successful in getting AHSC funds. So we're going to finish this and then open it up to Q&A. And I see there's still some questions there, which we'll answer live. So key takeaways are your GHG score is very important in determining whether or not you can be successful. Generally speaking, larger projects with more units have a higher GHG score for housing. Substantial bike and ped projects are required as well for another significant portion of the points on the application. And as I mentioned before, really partnering with the transit agency to get that ridership up in terms of new net ridership is going to be critical for a successful application. There's a couple of ways to get TA, and for us as TA providers and the state, you can go to the SGC website and fill out a form to see if the state would consider awarding you free technical assistance. The state determines that. And then you are welcome to solicit a fee-for-service contract from TA providers such as Enterprise. And obviously, as Chad mentioned, you can reach out to CHP directly for financial technical assistance for AHSC. In terms of the next cycle, this next round is coming out shortly, the final guidelines for AHSC round 8. Again, it occurs on an annual cycle. Will be December the 14th is when the guidelines will be adopted. The NOFA will come out sometime in January, hopefully by mid-Jan or around mid-January, with a 60-day application period, meaning that the actual deadline will be sometime in March with an award date of sometime in summer, maybe August. So wanted to give you the sense of the timeline. And then if you're not ready for this round, you can always apply for next round. So I'm going to segue us into the Q&A. Someone asked about tying commercial improvements to GHG reductions, for example, including a grocery store in a project where the nearest grocery would otherwise not be transit accessible. So the emphasis of the GHG reductions is what the project itself will do, meaning the housing development. So the only way that the GHGs can look at some scenario like that is if your housing development itself is actually a mixed-use project and it has publicly available commercial space. That can give you GHG reduction improvements. So we would need to test that. The square footage of that grocery store or publicly available space has to be rather large, though, to make a big dent on the GHGs. Otherwise, you are scored for proximity actually to employment opportunities. So actually that's perhaps a better barometer of your GHG competitiveness in terms of your project location. Second question is, do the transit-related amendment grants operate on a reimbursement basis? Yes, they do. It's drawn down, and if you're an applicant, you get to funnel those grants onto the transit partner or transit agency. The consequences of a transit agency is we don't know that yet, but there perhaps could be negative points associated with that. Generally, the expectation is that if you apply and are awarded, you can complete the improvements in 5 years. There is, however, an ability to request 2-year extensions to the executive director of SGC. So that's an option in terms of being unable to complete things within the 5-year time frame. Any additional is just for RIPA projects. Thanks. This is for the rural projects. I think the key thing for rural projects, it's the same logic as all the others, which is you have to really look for projects that have the ability to increase transit. And so that really depends on the geography. There's a little bit more leeway on the project area for rural projects. So in terms of proximity to ability to get bikeways and walkways built, there's a little bit more flexibility there. But again, I would encourage you to reach out to the TA team, and we have experts on the TA team who specialize on rural projects. So please reach out to me. Last question here is TA provided after a project receives an AHSC award? Good question. Unfortunately not. The TA that we provide, at least, is more or less focused on anything leading up to the application. Anything after that is outside of our purview. But we oftentimes get some implementation questions, but that's really not our expertise. If you are working on a phase project, is there a way to use the total unit count in your AHSC application versus just one phase of the project? Let me ask Chad to answer this from a financing perspective in terms of phases.
I believe the SGC and HCD in this updated round of guidelines have said that you cannot.
Yeah, that's right. And then the other, so that's actually a good strategy question. So if you do have a multi-phase project, in terms of the competitiveness, you have to either combine the phases to make a higher total unit count, or choose the phase that will have the larger unit count in order to be more competitive, if that makes sense. Okay. Looks like we have answered all the questions. So again, these slides will go out. SCAMP will send them out. We do appreciate your participation in this, and hopefully it was helpful. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to Chad and I. I'll put my email in the chat for anyone who has questions, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.